Good morning, friends. The basic idea of Sunday's message was that we can do all things through the Lord who strengthens us. And I'd like to take you to 2 Samuel 22, where we're going to see an awesome example of this happening in action. Because in 2 Samuel 22, we read the words of King David, a man who accomplished so very much in his life. In his youth, he killed the giant Goliath with but a sling and a stone. As he grew, he defended Israel from even more enemies, so much so that he was credited with slaying in the tens of thousands of foes. And while that is almost certainly another example of hyperbole, of purposeful exaggeration, the point still comes across quite clear. David was a mighty man of valor, a warrior. He gained victory for the nation of Israel over and over again. And we remember that he did this with actual flesh and blood physical foes in times, of course, of earthly battle and open warfare. But this does help us to understand how David serves as a type of Christ, pointing to the idea that the ultimate Christ, Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, that he would bring a much greater victory, not merely a physical victory to conclude an earthly battle, but that Jesus would win the ultimate spiritual, eternal victory, which certainly has a physical element to it, but much more than just a mere physical victory. Victory over sin and death itself, so that his people, the people of God, the saints, could not only have peace and joy for a certain time on this earth, but for all of time, for all the long and unending ages to come. And so I thought, since we're here, it's important to see how David's earthly victories relate to Christ's ultimate victory, because he is a type of Christ, one who foreshadows the real thing yet to come. But for our purposes today, as we read again from 2 Samuel 22, we keep in mind again that David is going to talk about the victories he's had, and those were victories over his physical earthly enemies, people who wanted to kill him, kill his people, who wanted to overthrow and conquer Israel as a whole. So as we read David's words here, we see his gratitude coming forward for what God did in granting him those kinds of victories. Because just taking one small section as an example, in verse 32 and following we read, "For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge and has made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great. You gave a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip." Now let's stop there for just a second, because we have this man, this king, David, a man of incredible renown and reputation, who has won so many victories and accomplished so many incredible feats in his life, so much so that when the Jewish population of the first century thought of the glory days, the days they wanted to return to, they thought of David's time. They wanted, once again, a king like him to reign and rule over them. And look at what he says about his ability to be that king that everybody wants, to do all those things that everybody gives him so much credit for, because his ability came from God. In this short section alone, he lays the foundational idea that God himself is the rock upon which he stands, that God is a refuge, a strong refuge for David. I mean, let's understand what that means, that a refuge is a shelter. It's a hiding place, a retreat to go to and find comfort and protection from all the things you can't handle on your own. This is the mighty King David admitting that he needs a shelter. He needs an escape. And he finds that in God, not in his own strength. It's not going to be the walls of his own fortresses or the might of his own armies or the wisdom of his own tactics that protects him and shields him, but the Lord that does that. So surely, if King David admits that he needs a safe place to retreat to, and that safe place is the Lord, then certainly we need just such a safe place as well, and we shouldn't be ashamed to admit it. And not only that, but David says that it was God that made his feet like those of a deer indicating sure-footedness, the idea that David always had a path forward, granted to him by God. Also, David admits that though he may be a great man of war, winning countless victories, it was the Lord who trained him to be able to do that. And I don't think that we should think then that God held literal training sessions with David, going over a curriculum of tactics or anything like that, but just the simple idea that it was the Lord who enabled David to have the necessary wisdom, the insight, and the prowess to win those battles. And just consider these two lines that we read a moment ago. David writes, "You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great." Now, I'm sure there were times when David went out to war and he used a shield. But the greatest shield he relied upon, as he says here, was the knowledge of God's salvation. That no matter what might befall him on the earth, God was with him, and God would preserve him according to his own goodness. And that second half, what a wonderfully odd juxtaposition, that David would say, "And your gentleness made me great." Now, when we think of greatness, great kings, great warriors, great leaders, well, gentleness is not generally the first thing on the list of attributes that immediately come to mind. Now, it's true David is talking about God's gentleness toward him in this case, but even then, how could God being gentle toward David make David great? Well, David may have been great, and he was, but we know he was far from perfect, right? David had sin, just like the rest of us, and in fact, David had egregious sin, perhaps, and I hope, well beyond what most of us have actually done with our outward actions, because you and I may have lusted after someone in our hearts, hated someone in our hearts, harbored anger and bitterness towards someone in our hearts, and maybe with our words, but I pray that few of us have actually committed the sort of adultery and murder the way that David did. So may we not conclude that it was God's gentleness in grace toward David that made David great? Meaning that had God not been gentle with David, David would not have survived to accomplish any of the other things that God had helped him and strengthened him to do, which leads to a wonderful personal application for you and me as well, because this brings us back to that foundational truth of God's graciousness. His gentleness, his kindness, his mercy, his graciousness toward us. That when we fail, when we fall, that does not immediately mark the end. God does not just cast us aside for the sake of our failures. Rather, the psalm that reminds us that God remembers that we are but dust. That psalm is fast becoming one of my most referenced psalms, at least of late, for this very reason, that God knows that we have no strength or ability in ourselves, and therefore he is kind and gentle and merciful with his people, patient and long-suffering, so that in his strength we might become great and accomplish great things in his name and for his honor and glory. And then as we continue, just one more little section I want to go over with you. We read some words from David that sound aggressive and almost barbaric. Is certainly out of place to our modern ear. But again, we remember that David is talking about ancient warfare of a very physical kind, and Israel had to deal with so many such enemies. And so David continues saying, "I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and did not turn back until they were consumed. I consumed them. I thrust them through, so that they did not rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me." And so David describes a certain overwhelming nature of his victories, how he destroyed his enemies, consuming them, as it were, until there was nothing left. But then, rather than giving into his own personal hubris and pride, exalting himself in glory, he immediately turns and gives credit to God. For once again, he says that it was not only God who gave him the strength for battle in the first place, but it was God that caused his enemies to fall to him. That it was God who accomplished the victory from beginning to end. That God is the one who prepared David for the battles, and it was God who handed David the victory in the battles. And which shows again that David was not passive in this process. He fought the battles. And I think it must be concluded that he would not have experienced the victory if he had not gone and actively fought the battles. Okay, therefore, it goes with what we said on Sunday. We must be active in this fight as well, because we can do all things through him who strengthens us. And yet we must recognize that it is God who strengthens us. David, as an example, David went to the battlefields. He fought the battles and all of the other political strife that this probably encompasses here. He was in the thick of it. And yet he trusted in the Lord, relied upon the Lord for strength, for wisdom, for comfort, for peace, for everything. And that's how he gained the victory. And so we need to do the same thing. To trust in the Lord, to rely upon him, to use God Most High himself as our place of safety, to run to him as our refuge, to know him and remember his promises and to seek his glory. And if those are the things that we concern ourselves with, then we cannot be defeated. For then all will go exactly according to God's perfect plan, because our greatest desire is to be in the midst of his will, so that his plan would be exactly what we want to have happen, whatever it might be. And then that is when he trains our hands for whatever lies before us. That is when God himself firmly plants our feet to walk the path he has for us. And if that's what's happening, then he is the one who will grant and guarantee the victory. So, brother, sister, trust him, seek him, know the Lord, and rely upon God Most High, and be active in the fight so that you can experience his strength working through you. With that encouragement, I do hope you are encouraged, and I also pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.